This is the Mixed Martial Arts Beat for the 4th week of June 2014. Hello again, everyone. I'm Ariel Helwani inside our New York City studio. Thank you so much for joining us once again. Got a familiar panel in the house, a lot to discuss, so let's get right into it. Joining us from MMAfighting.com and the SiriusXM Fight Club, that is Luke Thomas. Here we have the man with the shirt from SportsIllustrated.com. You know him. He is Jeff Wagenheim, and back by popular demand from the MMA Hour right here on MMAfighting.com. That is Eric Jackman. All right, guys, let's get into it. Next week, UFC 175 and the TUF finale in Las Vegas, a big week for the UFC. And I always view that July 4th event as sort of the midway point for the year. And the UFC has built it up to be a really big deal for them. International Fight Week, all that stuff. And so I think it's time to look back at the first half of 2014. You know, we like to look back at the end of the year, at the year that was, the stories, etc. What, in your opinion, has been the story of the half year? You know, we're 7 months in, I guess you could say now. So I think it's, or six plus months in. I think it's apropos to look back. What do you think has been the biggest story of them all?
I think there's two ways to look at it, and there's some ways interconnected, because I think the absence of the stars could be one. Anderson Silva going away, GSP going away, Anthony Pettis being on the shelf, Cain Velasquez being on the shelf, right? And that has contributed to what I think is actually the larger story here, which is the UFC's growth of schedule. Now, that doesn't mean that the growth of schedule made the majority of the headlines. That doesn't mean that it was the one that was bringing us the most traffic, but I think it's the one that most affects their business. The UFC is right now in a position of international expansion and trying to serve a lot of masters, trying to serve the Ultimate Fighter master, trying to serve the Fox Sports master, trying to serve pay-per-view, trying to serve Fight Pass. And as a consequence, it has profoundly affected the way they do all of their events. We saw it last week at UFC, or however long ago, UFC 174. A lot of criticism about the strength of that card. That is due in no part, or no small part, not just to the absence of stars. Maybe they could have put a Cain Velasquez on that card, but certainly, no doubt about it, about the strength of their, or about the expansion of their schedule. We have an event Saturday, Tahuna versus Marquardt, as Mike Bond from MMA Junkie reported. First time two fighters are headlining a UFC card coming off back-to-back losses. If that doesn't tell you about a profound shift in the way they view events and how they want to grow their business, I don't know what will.
What do you think, Jeff?
Well, I think you make some really great points. I
know I do.
Wow. Even a blind squirrel.
Good thing.
But you know, because it's not just when you think about the fact that they've added events. There are 44 events by the end of this year, 13 pay-per-views. You go back just a couple of years, say 2 years or 4 years, the pay-per-view numbers, they had the same number of pay-per-views, but they have far fewer events. So your options were limited in how much you were going to be able to watch the UFC. I think in 2010 there were only 9 events that were not pay-per-views. So if you wanted to watch a UFC fight, you pretty much had to pay the freight for a UFC pay-per-view, and so that has affected. You know, I'm sure we'll get into the pay-per-view numbers, and that's certainly going to be a big thing, and that's made it a big topic. What I think is interesting, though, when we're talking about this year, you know, the thing that I brought up when we did this thing at the end of the year. Now, rather than patting myself on the back about what I was right about, which was that TRT was going to be the topic of 2014. I'll say the thing that I was wrong about, which was I thought that was going to be the story of all of 2014, but here we are halfway through the year, and it's already pretty much been resolved. I mean, it's pretty much, you know, it was resolved months ago, and you know, we had the residual stuff with the.
It's still lingering to a degree.
We've got the random tests and all that stuff. Maybe that will be one of the stories of the rest of the year, but. That's the thing that I'm a little surprised at, that even though I thought it was going to be the story of the year, I thought it was going to be the story of the year we're going to be talking about in December still, but by then, this thing might be completely gone.
I mean, I think 1A is the expanded schedule, 1B is TRT. I mean, some other ones that are interesting are the lack of pay-per-view stars, like Luke mentioned. Where is Nick Diaz? Where is Nate Diaz? Where are some of these guys that are going to draw? And I think because of the expanded schedule, they're being more impacted by that. But I mean, 1A is definitely the schedule, and 1B is definitely TRT.
I would say 1A is TRT. And not just TRT, but what Nevada has done with the random testing. I mean, look at 175, which is coming up in, you know, the halfway point event. That's been a debacle between Chael and Vanderlei and Vitor what happened in February with them banning TRT and the talk of it leading up to the Dan Henderson fight and Vitor Belfort pulling himself out of that card on Memorial Day weekend. I mean, that has really been the ongoing story of this year.
It has been a pretty ongoing story, and I would never say it's not important, hugely important, top 3, whatever, however you want to put it. But I think a company of this, the sport lives and dies with the UFC. Let's just sort of state that outright. And for a company like that to shift their business model to such a profound degree, which I'm not saying is a success or a failure. I think it's way too early to judge. I have some concerns, and I think I see some things that are going well. But I'm just pointing out, for a company of this magnitude, if they don't succeed internationally, you got some serious questions that you have to start asking. But now they may.
Well, what do you mean by succeeding internationally? Like, what are you basing that on? Like, how do we know how well the Germany event
People
did
just
in
think
Germany?
it's like inevitable they're going to break into China. How do you know? China could never open. How do you know they're going to break into Germany? Germany is Europe's largest economy. They may never scratch the surface of being a popular entity there. I think now, by the flip side, they're going to be a major success in Latin America. So I'm not really worried necessarily about the future, but I'm pointing out that this isn't consumer electronics where you have this battle of multi-billion-dollar corporations all trying to vie for the consumer who makes $100,000 a year or more worldwide. This is one company. And if they don't do it right, then the whole thing goes away. That is the most profound of consequences.
I don't know that I would agree that it's a success or failure thing right now. I think.
It's too early to judge.
I know. But even I don't even know that's really the playing field. I think the way you said about this being a different model for the business, I think that's really what it comes down to. And the UFC can roll onward whether they expand well or not, because now they're up to what I say 44 events for this year. Mm-hmm. Let's say that they don't really catch on. They do the same thing next year. Maybe next year they bring it up to 50 events, and it doesn't quite catch on. Well, they always can bring it back down. They still have all those the pay-per-views. They still have they've always been a pay-per-view driven company, and now they're saying, well, more of our events are not on pay-per-view. I think this year if you do the math,
14.
44 minus 13.
13 or 14, right?
So that's like 30 or 31 events that are not on pay-per-view. Well, if they start shrinking that number, they're still going to have the pay-per-views, and maybe then they'll be able to put stronger cards together. So I don't know that they're really on the fire right there. I think they just need to figure out whether they're doing what they're doing now, whether it's going to succeed or not succeed, but more whether it's going to keep going in that direction, really.
I don't think it would be so easy to scale back. I think there'll be lasting consequences to watering down these cards and to people knowing that I don't have to tune in to see the best fights anymore because I can skip this card because it's not going to be good. And there's going to be lasting effects from that. And that's why I say that's 1A, because TRT, the fallout, is not going to be that much longer. It's at some point it's going to be finished and that's it. But this change in business model is going to impact them for many, many future years. And I think that that's why this is more crucial.
Yeah, just to piggyback on that, he's 100% right. People are like, oh, we'll just scale it back. Oh, really? Consequence free? That's what's going to happen? You're just going to go back to what it was after you've damaged the product. You're going to go back and say, oh, we've fixed it. Like you have to retain enthusiasm all the way through. And again, maybe I'm totally wrong and they scale back and that's fine. Or they keep going the direction they're going and that works out too. But I don't think it's the case that if you accept the idea that you have watered down cards that don't interest fans, and that if you let that linger for a long time and then go back to having non-watered down cards, that all of a sudden enthusiasm jumps right back like it just was before, I just think that's fantasy.
I think you can also make the claim that the top 3 stories of the year, the expanded schedule, the drug testing, and the lack of stars, all are related to each other because more events, you need stars to be on those events. You just lost 3 from UFC 175 due to the drug testing, and you have these other guys who are all injured. You need those guys when you're putting on these events. Also interesting to note, they've introduced Fight Pass, and it seems to me, at least right now, that they're putting a lot more time and attention into those cards than some of those free Fox Sports 1 cards. I mean, look at Dana White. He's been in China, he's been in Japan this past week, building up those cards. They put Kung Lee and Michael Bisping on a Fight Pass card, Roy Nelson and Mark Hunt on a Fight Pass card. Those Fight Pass cards, I don't want to talk about Nate Marquardt versus James Tahuna, but the ones coming up, some of them are looking better than those Fox Sports 1 cards. So they seem to really be putting all their eggs in that basket, at least right now.
Yeah, well, I mean, they clearly view it as the future. I mean, they've said it outright. And, talking about adding Meta Morris, Dana White was here in New York City at the Beat the Streets event for USA Wrestling, sitting right there watching these guys. If they took business from Flow Wrestling, I'd be kind of happy about that. But
wow.
well, whatever. Long story short, it's certainly an investment in the future, a long game. But this is my point, right? How do you sell Fight Pass? You have to put on fighters. And Kung Lee versus Michael Bisping, that's a great fight. Tyron Woodley versus Jong Hyun Kim, who hates that? That's an awesome fight. You have to put on those kinds of events that make it sales worthy. But that means if you got to rob Peter to pay Paul at the current juncture, and that to me has some issues that deserve to be examined.
Well, we'll have to see whether they. When we're talking about the long term, right now we're looking at the short term. These guys, this is a new service, relatively new service, and so yeah, they're pumping some real good fights in there. They debut was Gustafsson, right? That was the first one they did.
Was that the first one?
No, the debut was Singapore.
Okay, right, the second one. So, but they put a Gustafsson fight that was going to essentially put him back into a title shot on there, early on. So they're clearly saying we're going to front load this stuff with quality fights. And I guess if you're say robbing Peter to pay Paul, well, I guess they've already established what they can or can't do on Fox. So now they're going to try to build this thing up and see whether we have a whole new side of the revenue stream.
Let's say we're sitting here, Eric, in December, late December, and we're looking back at the entire year that was. That means we've already established what has happened between January and July. What's the story of 2014? What do we need to look at now that we've established these topics? Is it still going to be, drug testing, lack of stars, expanded schedule, or is there something else that you're really looking forward to?
It's going to be the expanded schedule. It's going to be whether this was a success or a failure for this year. Boxing suffered, lower pay-per-view buys. UFC is obviously suffering lower pay-per-view buys. This year was a test, and it's going to be a determination on how they move forward. Now, as we talked about, I'm not so sure they can just easily scale it back, but they might have to start planning for that, and there will be groundwork laid for that, which will lead to another change, and it'll continue to snowball like that. So I think that there's no question that's still the story by the end of the year.
What do you think, Jeff?
I think you can actually zero in even closer and go right to the pay-per-views, because we know we've got a Cain Velasquez fight that's going to headline a pay-per-view. What else is scheduled? Is there also
well, Anthony Pettis and Gilbert Melendez might be actually the first week of January, but kind of
and Hendricks too. We think we'll probably get something from him.
Gustafsson Jones,
and then we got Jones Gustafsson. That's four pay-per-view headliners, but there are more than 4 pay-per-views remaining the rest of the year. So what are you going to do with the rest of those? They almost always, with maybe one exception a year, they have to have a title fight. So what are they going to do? And are they going to bring Mighty Mouse back out there? He didn't do so well in the last one. So I think that if you zero in on the pay-per-views, that could be a real interesting story for the rest of the year.
This is why Fight Pass is actually so important. When it first launched, I was pretty critical of it, but now I think it's actually a pretty good service. I mean, I'm not going to enjoy getting up at 4 a.m. to cover Saturday's card, but that's neither here nor there. I think the reality is, why can't UFC do Jones, Gustafsson, and Sweden without a ton of headaches? Because the reality is more than 50% of UFC's revenue, Zuffa I should say, comes from pay-per-view today. That is the primary driver of revenue. And until that changes, they have to cater to North American sensibilities and realities. That's how it works. The reason why Fight Pass is important is because if you can now change the dynamic where you're no longer required to service a pay-per-view industry, at least to the same extent you were before, now you're really mobile. I don't just mean you can go to Australia. I mean you can take a title fight to Australia. You can take Jones Gustafsson. You can put it on. You don't have to do it at 4 a.m. when all the sun is still out with all the weird geography and whatnot in Sweden. So that's the reality. And will they get to a point where they can do that? I don't know. But that's the goal. Get off pay-per-view to the extent where you're tied to it, and now really transform your product.
I'm zeroing in on 2 stories. One, can they make Anderson Silva versus Nick Diaz? Because you saw our reaction to that. You see the fans' reaction to that. They need this fight. They sorely need this fight. You think about last year, around this time, they had that world tour, and they had all these big fights lined up with all the champions. They don't really have anything like that lined up. They got some big fights, but nothing that's really getting the fans excited. Anderson Silva versus Nick Diaz would get the fans excited, and it would do well on pay-per-view, in my opinion. So can they get that done? The other one is Tough 20, because in my opinion, Tough here in the United States is in deep trouble. I mean, you look at this past season, Dana White said that it was the worst season. And
I thought the critics said it was one of the best ones ever.
That's right.
I was so confused by that marketing.
It's really amazing how I feel like we're in tune with the people, with the hardcore fans. No one's talking about it. No. On Twitter, no one's talking about it. And they've validated that by saying it was a bad season. Now, Tough 20 is for a title. Tough 20 features 16 of the very best fighters at 115 pounds. They are introducing a weight class essentially for this show, to give this show, you know, some new life. If it has the same impact that Tough 19 has had, if people just kind of ignore it and wait for the finals when there's a tournament to crown a new champion, that would signal, in my opinion, the end of The Ultimate Fighter. Now, I think it has a future in Latin America. I think it has a future with what they're doing to a degree in Japan, this new deal that they announced, and in other new markets. But if Tough 20 fails, then I think we might start talking about a new kind of reality show, or just taking a break from that, at least here in North America.
It seems like that's a kind of a, it's a strange test to put on Tough, because that's the only time there's going to be a title on the line. I mean, I know we had a title shot on the line before, but it's not a typical. You know, so let's say it succeeds. You know, and I don't know if it will, because they have a hard enough time attracting fans to the men's 125-pound division. Much less now we're going to go to the women's 115. That's that's going to be hard to do. But let's say they do that. Is that really going to say much for Tough 21 or beyond? I don't know that it really will.
At least it breathes some new life into the program.
Yeah, maybe. But there's also the other side of it is, now in this the business model they have now, where there's 13 or 14 pay-per-views and a lot of other programming, 30 or more shows that have real MMA fighting, real professional UFC fighters on them for the most part. Tough used to be something like the one thing you could watch when there wasn't a pay-per-view. There were a few other things, but for the most part, that was the one connection people had to the sport.
Right.
It's no longer necessary. Whether you think the quality of the fighting is good or bad, I mean, it seems like that's the way Dana White was criticizing it. It's almost irrelevant now. It's like, is it really even necessary to be there?
I agree with Jeff. I think we're way past that point with Tough. I think it's already become way stale. Changing out the characters, putting a belt on the line isn't going to do anything. It needs a drastic format change, or to just be scrapped completely. It's like if I'm eating the same meal every single day and then you give me with a little extra sauce, it's not going to do much for me. Give me something different, and this is not something different. Regardless of the fact that the belt's on the line, people are just sick of Tough. It's stale. It's like the UFC cards that they're putting on now. At a certain point, people are just done with it, and they're completely done with Tough, as far as I know.
You're not into the Scott Coker special sauce, then? Is that what
Let me say, what's funny is everyone complains about the fights, and I've actually tried to watch the fights this season. The UFC's done a good job of emailing those out to press ahead of time, and I would watch the fights, and Dana White would be like, these guys just aren't hungry enough. And I'm like, maybe they're just not good enough. I don't think that they're bad fighters. They're not terrible fighters. I'm not watching this going like, oh my God. But limited fighters are capable of limited possibilities. But what's interesting about that is, what is the highest rated season in the Ultimate Fighter history? No doubt about it, season 10.
Yep.
The Kimbo/Roy Nelson season, which coincidentally featured the worst fights ever in Ultimate Fighter history. Terrible, terrible fights that did amazing ratings. So I'm not convinced that the idea is they can't just shuffle in some star power and at least make it work again. If you count in, I found this out, if you count in DVR numbers for the Ronda Rousey Miesha Tate season, it beat almost every Bellator event on Spike TV, including the ones that they had their +3 DVR. I mean, that's kind of crazy. Like, maybe the live ratings weren't great, but people were watching it after the fact. I don't know which way to lean with the women, right? Because you could say the quality of fights are going to be much better. These are the best 115-pound women. Okay, cool. It's for a title, even more higher stakes. Women have done well on ratings, but Pettis and Melendez, amazing fighters, but not needle movers. So I could see the ratings being really good, and I can see them being about where they are today. I'm going to take a wait-and-see approach.
All right, let's move along, because I think an interesting story is developing coming off of UFC 174, and the UFC will never confirm or deny, really. Oh, maybe they'll deny it if it's way off base, pay-per-view numbers. But it seems like all signs point to at least the fact that those numbers weren't good for UFC 174. I was told they were the worst in 8 years. Now, we've heard, this is in the kind of territory of the Bellator numbers, if you want to believe those numbers, and obviously Spike TV is sticking by them. Dana White disagrees with them. But the point is that show did not do well. Everyone would agree with that. Is this something that the UFC should be panicking about? Because they put Demetrious Johnson on Fox in a main event 3 straight times last year, and it resulted in that. Was this just a matter of bad timing, as far as there was a lot on the sports schedule that day or that week? Demetrious Johnson just isn't clicking, as we've discussed on this show. Was the card just weak? Are UFC pay-per-views in trouble? What do you take away from all of this?
I mean, I'm sure I can't wait to hear what they have to say, because this you know why? Because it's a complicated issue. There's a lot of moving parts on this one. First of all, as you mentioned, I think a quite astute point. You're one of your few. No, I'm teasing. I'm just beating him up because of his beard. Boxing has also had some issues with pay-per-view. I mean, Mayweather had the amazing Canelo pay-per-view returns, which, you know, blockbuster ratings or blockbuster numbers, but, you know, didn't do that well against Maidana. May have not even cleared 1 million. That is a little sketchy. Cotto and Martinez doing 300, 315. Pay-per-view is in itself in trouble, you know. So no matter if the UFC was putting on better cards, I don't think you'd see the days where you have Machida versus Evans. Remember that fight card? That fight card did 635,000 buys. John Jones can't sniff that unless he's fighting Rashad Evans in a grudge match. So pay-per-view in general is in trouble. We have to give UFC and all pay-per-view providers the benefit of that doubt, I think. But, I mean, this sort of harkens back to the conversation we had previously. I mean, going into that fight, was anybody surprised? The lesson about Fox, to me, has been you just can't turn water into wine. You can put on good cards and guys will watch it, although the ratings for Demetrius Johnson have not been great. But it didn't turn Ben Henderson into a pay-per-view star either. What it may have done for Ben Henderson is turn him into a TV draw. Listen, I'm not going to pay for this guy, but you know what? If he's fighting on TV, okay, I'll watch that. With Johnson, you know, and I know he called me out in your interview, and I felt so bad because he is such a tremendous talent and such a nice guy. But the numbers don't lie, man. What are we supposed to say here? Like, if this doesn't precipitate a crisis, what will? 100,000 for the competition, and I'm long-winded here. 100,000 for the competition has always been the standard, and UFC's always been above it. It's never moved. The UFC's regressing towards it. You understand that? Like, the competition's always looked at that as like the breakthrough mark, and UFC was so far above it, it was never an issue. Now we are at a point where we are at a meeting place. That is, I mean, I cover this business for a living. That is scary. That is super scary.
Are you done?
Yeah, I'm done. Sorry.
I think that you raised all different, you listed a whole bunch of possible scenarios, and I was sitting there thinking, yes, 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 yes. I think there's a lot of things that are going on.
A perfect storm.
Yeah, I mean, Demetrius Johnson has not yet achieved that star status, and it's hard to know what it is that gets somebody there, because we think, okay, well, if a guy goes out there and just, you know, starches the competition. Well, he went out there and beat the second best guy in his weight class, knocked him out in 2 minutes in the fight previous to this. That didn't do it. You know, maybe if he had been fighting John Dodson, who's perceived as the best challenger for him, instead of a guy who, you know, doesn't speak the language and was not a guy that could lend a hand in the promotion, maybe that wouldn't. But I think that we're sort of grasping at straws here. I think that it comes down to the change in the business model. The expectations have to be less. If you've got 31 opportunities or so to watch the stuff for free, or for as long as you pay your cable bill or pay your $10 a month for the Fight Pass, you know, maybe your standards are a little higher for when you're going to fork over the $55 for the pay-per-views. And I don't think that this has taken the UFC by surprise. I think they understand it. They're moving in a different direction. So maybe their expectations are lower. Now, when they get down that low to 100,000 allegedly, we have to start looking at, you know, where is that point where they're making any kind of a profit. I mean, we know how much money that brings in, and we know that they have production costs. We know also they don't get all the money for a pay-per-view. So, you know, I'm not sure where the number falls, but they have to have looked at this and said, well, we can still, you know, we can survive on this, but when we have our bigger guys, we need to really, you know, push farther. I just think it's a sign of the times more than anything, as Luke just so succinctly said.
I think the way to encapsulate it is just to say the sky is not falling. A lot of people make this into a bigger deal than it is. They want to bury the UFC. They want to prematurely throw them in the grave. The sky isn't falling. As Luke mentioned, Benson Henderson, he just did the third highest FS1 card just recently, this month.
Right.
So people are still tuning in to see these stars, but maybe, to Luke's point, they're only building stars for free TV. We've yet to see who people are willing to pay for, but obviously the flyweights are not the people.
I'm really curious to see how 175 does, because if you can build off of Chris Weidman beating Anderson Silva twice in dramatic fashion, Ronda Rousey being on the card, Machida, as you mentioned, you know, he's a name and I guess used to be a draw, you know, so he's fighting for the title. Uriah Faber is not on the pay-per-view, but, you know, he is on the Fox Sports 1 prelim, so maybe that will push people to get the pay-per-view. I'm curious to see how that show does, and if that does in the 200, 100 range, then I think we should, you know, start panicking.
You don't think it'll be there, though, do you?
No, I don't.
What do you think?
UFC 175.
Give me a range.
Yeah, I'm thinking in the in the 600 to 500 to 600 range. I think 4 to 6. 4 to 6. What do you think?
6 might be a little high, but yeah, 4 to 6 is about right.
Maybe I'm putting too much, stock in Weidman right now, but I just feel like people want to see him continue his journey. I mean, he just beat Anderson Silva twice. You would hope that he would now take that baton and become somewhat of a draw himself.
Yeah, well, the three-way fight that fell apart, though, is really, that really hurts. I mean, any form of that. It would have been cool, obviously, Vanderlei against Sonnen is an amazing grudge match, but, Sonnen against Belfort, Belfort against Vanderlei. I mean, you just like put them have each one of these guys, all three of these guys available, and each fights the other one for a round. It'll be just amazing stuff.
Maybe 600 was a little high. 3 to 5. I feel like 5 is kind of that breaking point to superstardom. So I don't know if they'll get that, but maybe 3 to 5 because there's not much there between Rousey and Davis right now, even though Rousey is a big star. Okay, one guy, as you mentioned, who was supposed to be on that card was Vitor Belfort. Not on that card. His wife tells me that he has been told that he will get the winner of Weidman versus Machida. Now I want to know, we'll start with you. What do you think? Does he deserve that shot, considering everything that's happened this year?
Deserve is a little bit of a loaded word.
Would you give him that shot?
Absolutely. Based on the resume alone, there's nobody else that has the wins that he has. Last year, he knocked out Dan Henderson, Luke Rockhold, and Michael Bisping. There's nobody else in that division who can lay claim to a caliber of fighter that he has. There's guys like Jacare who's streaking as well, but the caliber of fighter he's faced just isn't the same.
But he failed the drug test.
Now, okay, but unless we're going to go back and put asterisks next to his wins, what argument is there for not giving Vitor Belfort the title shot?
Yeah, it's kind of like, by the way, it's kind of like the Hall of Fame and Roger Clemens and Mark McGuire. Like, we can go back and say these guys were cheating, but in the moment, they weren't. So what do you do?
Well, they might have been, but
they weren't breaking the rules. They weren't doing anything wrong. No one was.
Well, it's up to the. It's
like a tree falling in the forest. How do you know? What do you determine as breaking the rules? Right?
Like that. If Vitor's saying that he's been promised this, no reason to doubt him. He's never said anything that's not been true before. But it's really. I think that the UFC. It's not up to the UFC. Ultimately, it's up to the Nevada State Athletic Commission. He not only failed the drug test, but I think that his admission, we really need to pull that apart a little bit. It wasn't simply that he had not yet gotten off the TRT. It was that even the levels that he had were exceeded the levels that were allowable for therapeutic use. So even if Nevada had not banned TRT and they had gone ahead and tested him randomly, he would have failed the test. So that says something. And what it says to me is that if the Nevada State Athletic Commission gives him a license, I lose some respect for that organization because.
But what if they book the fight in Cincinnati? Of course, Nevada would kind of have to give their blessing, but he doesn't need that Nevada license.
Well, but the UFC doesn't do that, do they? Do they?
Well, he has not been suspended by Nevada. He can't be suspended. My take on the whole situation was the UFC wasn't putting him in that position if they didn't know in the back of their mind that he was going to be okay. They started to promote that fight. You know what I mean? Yeah. They're not just going to take that chance and hope that 2 weeks before he gets his license, right?
Yeah.
Unless you're just trying to get people to buy tickets and then you worry about the consequences. What do you think?
Those are the three issues. One is at the resume. Resume looks like it's got a pretty good case, all things being considered here. The second case is, we just talked about the last 6 months being a bit of a wasteland of today, in the words of Linkin Park.
Very fitting, given the fact that
worst music on earth. So I think guys who can move the needle, and Vitor Belfort can certainly move the needle. He's got I like Jacare. I'm a big fan of his, and what he can do.
Nice accent there.
The World Cup has got me.
Sure,
it's got me already.
Working on it.
But the reality is Vitor Belfort is such a huge name. He can really, really do a lot of things, not just in the United States, but also in Brazil too. Where that fight I'm sure would be airing on Globo. So, so there's that. But then lastly, it's the licensing issue. Those are the three things here we're looking at. If he gets the licensing, I don't see how you don't book it. But there's a question about whether or not he deserves a licensing altogether, and you guys have kind of covered that. So.
The press for that fight and the buzz for that fight has returned, given the lightning rod that he is. When you make the case that he's a bigger name, what are you gonna, at this point everyone's booked except for Rockhold isn't booked. You can make the case. Would you give it to Rockhold, or he hasn't done enough?
I don't think you can give it to anybody except Vitor if Vitor's available. I think that if he has a license, he's got to get the shot. But I think that these are the issues we're talking about. they may have to look for Plan B if the commission does what I think it ought to be doing.
Rockhold hasn't had that star-making performance yet, and frankly, neither has Jacare. I mean, they've kind of looked pretty good, but they haven't quite had that one opponent where you can be like, oh my God, they did it.
Right, because they weren't booked against one.
No, that's true.
That's why I think that Rockhold versus Jacare would have made the most sense next.
I think the rematch?
Yeah.
Yeah, that'd be good.
On
I
UFC
think
turf, but it's not
Musashi
happening.
is of that caliber, though.
Right.
I think he's proven himself. He did better than I expected against Lyoto Machida, even though I thought that Machida dominated that fight. He showed that he's still in the top tier of middleweights, and I think that fight will prove something.
Next weekend is so fascinating, in my opinion, because not only do you have back-to-back UFCs, Saturday night you have UFC 175, then the tough finale on Sunday, but you also have World Series of Fighting's NBC debut. Now, I know sometimes that we can scoff at World Series of Fighting, but let's note that they had their best ratings ever for them, plus 300,000 last Saturday, with a card with no real big name on that card, and they're making their debut on NBC. This is significant. And NBC has never aired live MMA before. They used to have that Strikeforce deal at midnight on Saturday when Ken Shamrock was calling the action, but that was old stuff. This is new stuff, and it has arguably their biggest star. I mean, he is a face. He is a name. He is someone that media has been drawn to, Nick Newell, because of his story. And yet they're airing this show right before the UFC 175 prelims from 4 to 6 p.m. Eastern Time on July 4th weekend. And of course, this isn't World Series of Fighting's top choice, but this just shows to me that NBC is not all that committed to MMA. I mean, yeah, they might sign a deal and they may extend it, but let's just put them on July 4th weekend, and the second NBC show is essentially Christmas weekend at the end of the year. Let's just plug a hole when there's no other programming that we want to really invest in. I can't really get excited about this. This doesn't feel like a big deal, and it should be a big deal. This is one of the big four. It's the Peacock showing live MMA.
Oh, I disagree completely, man. I think it's actually a pretty strong commitment on their part. Dude, NBC is run by old people.
Right.
Like, that's just how you have to, I mean, that it is on the major network at all is a minor miracle. And this is what they do with boxing, too. Didn't they air Cunningham versus Adamek on that?
Yep.
At basically the same time, and I think it did okay ratings. You're never going to get those like blockbuster ratings at that time. It's like, okay, they put a cap on what they can do. But as a lead-in, it's an interesting fight. It's one that can get people to turn. Some people are probably home by then. It's frankly for MMA about as family-friendly a story as you're going to get. Nick Newell, who's an awesome guy. Again, you have to have in your description managed expectations, but I do think it's a pretty big deal.
Yeah, I think that NBC was paying attention enough to not book it opposite UFC, which would have been insane.
Right.
They also were paying attention enough not to book it on Sunday afternoon, so it will be bookended by UFC events where there'd be just an overload. So nobody's, on Saturday afternoon, nobody who likes MMA has watched MMA fighting yet.
Get in early.
They're waiting for the fights later, so hey, boss, let's tune in at 4 o'clock and watch it. The only conflict there is a World Cup quarterfinal. So unless the U.S. Somehow spoils things for them, it would be the audiences are different enough. There's not a conflict there. I think that they would have been better off if they had more of the UFC guys who were supposed to be fighting, like Paul Harris and the first was Paul Harris and Fitch, and then Paul Harris falls out. Then you get Shields in there. I think either of those fights would have been a better, would have been better. Would have drawn some more people. People would have recognized those names. I don't know that people are going to want to see Fitch against Dennis Hallman, right?
Yes.
And I know that also Galard is going to fight too.
Right.
So there's some names that people might recognize, but it's a shame. We have two young, undefeated fighters in the main event, and it'd be nice if there were a little more support around them. Having just Fitch, having just Melvin in there, it's enough. It's okay, but I don't think it's enough.
I mean, obviously, it's not an ideal situation, but haven't we been conditioned by the UFC to watch 2 events in one day? I mean, that's kind of the path that we're on. So I don't think that it's going to be as big a death strike as people may think. It's going to be fine. People will tune in, and then they'll watch the UFC later.
Can't help but feel bad for WSOF. I mean, they're going to get no media attention. All the media is going to be in Vegas.
Where's that fight being held?
That fight is being held in Florida. And there's some big...
Or you can drive your car on the beach.
Well, there's some big Daytona race, and I think that's why they put it there, to get that crowd that will be there. I'm not much of a race car guy, but that's what I hear.
But you know what? The World Series of Fighting has like... somehow managed to keep going in spite of some of the resources that they have or don't have, I should say. Now, I sort of view their ratings on NBC Sports as like Bellator ratings on MTV2. Like one week it'd be like 150,000, next week it'd be 4. You'd be like, how is that even possible? This card is way worse than the last one. But they have done really good for NBC, or really well, I should say, for NBC Sports in the you know, if you look in the totality of their programming. And again, I don't think it's going to be necessarily a ton of MMA fans watching that. I think you will get MMA fans watching that. I think you're going to get a lot of just people surfing around who are saying, hey, I'll check out this sort of weird, interesting story.
We're almost a week out before the event. I thought there'd be more buzz for Nick Newell. I mean, he has such a great story. Maybe, you know, even SportsCenter and other, you know, sports outlets like A Real Sports on HBO. I mean, I thought they'd really try to push this guy, because they're putting him in the main event on NBC. That's a pretty big deal, and NBC has never done this, as I said. So I don't know. Let's see what happens in the next 10 days or so. And so, as you mentioned, it's interesting because you have that, and it comes in first. So maybe that will help the MMA fans, and you know, not give them too much of an overload, as you said. And then you have UFC 175, and then you end the weekend with BJ Penn versus Frankie Edgar. And the reason I'm thinking about BJ Penn now, of course, he's coming back, but I saw that documentary. Didn't any of you see that on Fox Sports?
I watched it yesterday.
I thought it was great.
It was really good.
And it really, did you? I know you're a big.
Seen it yet.
You haven't seen it. As a big BJ Penn, have you seen it?
I have it on. I did not watch it.
I recommend watching it. I recommend to the people out in internet world to watch it as well, because it really reminds you about how special this guy is and how different he is and what he's done with his life. You know, moving his family to this. It seems like he lives on a farm now. And it got me excited about BJ Penn, because I was kind of torn about his return. I was thinking, like, man, you know, this is not the fight that I want to see him in. He lost twice to this guy. I want to see something fresh. I don't really care to see him at 145. But now I'm getting excited about BJ Penn, and I feel like there's enough there with Frankie Edgar being on the sidelines for a year, and the new weight class, and just BJ being back, and he seems to be reinvigorated. Of course, we always say this before all his fights. How do you feel? And I'll start with you, because I know you're a big BJ guy. I mean, how do you feel?
So 10 days before, if you've heard this one before. BJ Penn loses at welterweight.
Yeah.
Takes a little bit of time off. Coach is tough. Comes back at a lighter weight class against his nemesis, and you fill in the rest. You're going to be excited to. First of all,
is this Jens Pulver? Is that what you're saying?
This is
Jens Pulver.
He's coming back at a lower
rear naked choke
at a lower weight class, and he's going to either establish that he still belongs, like he did in the past, which I think is a possibility, or he's going to prove that he just can't hang anymore. But I think the thing to be aware of is that BJ Penn, people love him regardless. And the UFC needs some of its stars back. And BJ Penn is one of those stars.
Yeah, the thing which I took from this fight was, we often hear Dana White talk about guys who are retiring. Whenever a star retired, people inevitably ask him, well, did you talk to him? Did you get behind him? He always says, well, I never question a guy who's going to retire, because when you're thinking about retiring, it's time for you to walk away. Now, it seems to me that I remember after one of the last fights that BJ was in, Dana suggesting that this might be a time for him to walk away from the sport. Well, now they need some star power. And so what do? They dangle in front of him the one sort of ghost from his past, Although,
to be fair, he asked for this fight.
Well, sure.
They gave it to him, but he's the one that asked.
But he did ask for it.
They were thinking about Benson Henderson for him.
Right, but this was, they're like, well, we're gonna give him the guy that we know. It's like
the pebble in his shoe, as he called it.
We know that he's gonna take that. So, so from that side of it, I'm a little bit, queasy about it, I guess. But I feel like, we've seen Frankie Edgar beat him twice. I don't know that I'll watch it, of course, but I'm not as excited about this one just because it's a new weight class. It doesn't excite me that much.
There's a great line from the documentary, and BJ says, "I don't even know what I'm searching for anymore, but birds fly, fish swim. This is what I do." On the one hand, that gives you the chills, right? It's like, oof, what a born warrior, On the other hand, it's like, you don't even know what you're looking for, I on the one hand, I look at this fight and I say, Frankie Edgar has looked good at featherweight, but not. I mean, he struggled with Charles Oliveira a little bit, and I thought he was going to blow the doors off of him. So he's been looking good. Don't get me wrong. I'm not in any way saying he's been like, he's fallen off. I just don't know that the weight class necessarily has benefited him in the way some of us had imagined. But, if you go back and watch the Ultimate Fighter that you referenced, Tough 5, man, BJ was full of vinegar and piss on that show.
Yeah.
And now he's like elder statesman BJ, which is where he should be in his career, He's done everything. He held 2 titles, amazed fans all over the world, literally. What is there left for him to do? Won the World Championships in Jiu-Jitsu in 2000, all that stuff. So, for me, if he surprises me, I couldn't be happier about it. But I'm not expecting too much of a surprise.
So as a BJ guy, I mean,
Sure.
is this enough? Just him coming back, is that enough, or is it kind of one of those things where you're happy he's back, but this is not really the fight that you wanted to see him back? Like
This is the fight I wanted.
This is the fight.
I love
really?
this fight because
Well,
first of all, the first fight. I'll go to the grave. BJ won that
BJ
fight.
won the first fight.
All right,
yeah.
BJ won that fight, so it's 1-1. The second fight, he looked disinterested. I mean, there's the funny GIF online of the cornerman putting the banner in, and it touches his ear, and he just doesn't even know.
He had no reaction.
Just like it. I think he's going to be motivated for this fight. Obviously, he specifically requested. He has no direction, but he specifically requested this fight. He knows he wants that at the very least. He wants another shot at Frankie, and I think if you can get BJ in shape, which is always the question, and you can get him motivated, he's going to put on a performance. Whether it's as good as we have it seen from the past, he's getting older, so Father Time never loses. But I believe that at the very least, we'll get a vintage performance.
Maybe he lucks out because Frankie hasn't fought in a year, and he wasn't injured or anything. He's just been put on the sidelines, taped this show. Remember, they taped this show in October of last year, so it's been a while.
And to Luke's point, he hasn't looked great at featherweight. He's been serviceable, but he hasn't looked great.
I'm just happy we get to hear that music again. His entrance song, in my opinion, the best.
Brother Ease.
Oh, it's just so great. All right, let's end on this. It's Saturday morning, 2:30 a.m. Eastern Time. The first fight starts.
Luke's at work. Yay!
UFC Fight Pass, and then it all ends at around 1 a.m. Early Sunday on Fox Sports 1. Thankfully, this time around, there's a bit of a break in between. I think that's a lot more manageable. If you're a UFC fan, you can watch it early in the morning, and then you can come back late at night. Give the people a reason to watch these fights. Is there one fighter? Is there one story? Is there? Of course, the Cub Swanson Jeremy Stephens one is a layup because there's a potential title at stake here. But give them a reason.
Well, I don't know about the first. The first card is really not that good. I don't know if there's much of a reason to watch that unless you have some sort of particular attachment to people on the card. But it is a layup. But honestly, that. I will give, there's no denying it. That Cub Swanson Jeremy Stephens fight is just is going to be amazing. Jeremy Stephens, different than Frankie Edgar, has surprised everyone and looked awesome at featherweight. And Cub Swanson has had a bit of a career resurgence. I think everyone wrote him off after that Aldo loss in WEC, and then he had a couple of other hiccups here and there, but. I really think that fight is gonna. I don't know if it's gonna go the full 5. But I definitely feel like the problem with MMA today, for me, is that there's this is not just UFC, this is all promoters. There's so much MMA that you lose perspective really on who's special and why. And this is one of those fights where the technical level will be so high and the level of grit and determination so high that you'll clearly be able to discern, you could never watch MMA in your life and be able to say, okay, these two guys are better than all these other guys.
Well, I think that we're talking about technical ability, then I'm going to go the opposite and say the UFC needs heavyweights on their roster. So they've got, Pelele and Rochelle. This is not going to be a fight.
That's your fight to watch.
That's not going to be that's not going to be a fight of great technical ability. It's not going to be a fight of great energy. But the UFC being starving for heavyweights, they're going to need two guys that are just going to go out there and bang something. Obviously,
So's looked good as of late. I mean, the competition hasn't been great, but he's been dominant.
So is 36 years old. So if he's going to step forward, he's got to step forward right away. So I'm going to look at this. I'm going to say there's a fight that I'm not going to stay up till the middle of the night to watch, and I think that to me is sort of emblematic about what this is all about. When the UFC started programming 2 fight cards in a day, we talked about, sometimes those foreign cards aren't for you. But the last time they did it, I think they started at noon and went till 1 a.m. So theoretically, you could watch straight through. This one, how many people on the East Coast are going to stay up at 2:30 in the morning and watch this thing straight through? I don't think
the beauty of fight passes, you can just wake up and watch it right away.
So this is going to be an on-demand card for probably the majority of people who watch it, if they watch it, and I don't know that they're going to even watch that fight. I don't think it's going to be the most technically sound battle, but the UFC needs heavyweights.
But that's your pick.
No,
that's your pick.
Wow, that is shocking.
Just to be frank, there's not a lot on either of these cards that interest me. The main event, obviously, Stephens and Swanson. If I gun to my head, I'd say Gastelum and Musoke, just because I want to see if Gastelum's a blue chip prospect. Outside of that, I'm going to be watching because I'm always watching. I know there's some people, Luke, I know you're not interested in watching these guys who you feel are not UFC caliber. I'll be watching, but it's not a situation where I'm going to be intently, studying these guys for future performances.
For Rick's picks.
For Rick's.
A little plug there. Correct me if I'm wrong. Isn't Oliveira and Hyoki going to bet? Okay, so that's another one that you should definitely, two guys that are very high caliber. Let me just say though, everyone can have their own UFC. You can have the UFC that you enjoy. I enjoy UFC on these terms. I enjoy UFC no matter, or MMA really. World Series of Fighting. Bellator did 26 shows last year. You can enjoy MMA on your own terms. But for me, the Ultimate Fighting Championship is a premium product. And I'm only going to recommend to anyone else the premium side of it. If they want to expand their schedule past premium, that's their choice, and they can if they make $1 billion doing it, great, awesome. But for me, I watch UFC because it's the only product that is the premium product. And for me, you can't grow a premium product at scale. It will always only be a very narrow bunch. So with that, Stevens and Swanson is a premium product.
It wasn't on this set, it was on our old set, but there was a time where we were doing the MMA Hour, and there was a guy by the name of John Volante who came on. He said, "Can I bring my friend with me?" And I said, "Sure, you can bring your friend." I never heard of the guy, but you could bring him on the set. His name was Chris Weidman. I had no idea who Chris Weidman was, or at least I had heard of him, but my guest to come in studio was John Volante prior to the Strikeforce Heavyweight Grand Prix. He was in an alternate fight against Chad Griggs. There was a lot of buzz about John Volante here on the Northeast. His UFC career hasn't gone to plan, and his last fight, I thought he should have won the fight on paper, but he obviously had some problems.
Maldonado fight?
Yeah, he just completely gassed out. He is the first fight of this entire experience at 2:30 a.m. I want to see John Volante. Some of that champion, he spars with Chris Weidman. It's got to rub off on him. He's got to put it together. I want to see if John Volante gets back on track.
And if you ever talk to him, he's hilarious.
He is hilarious.
He's a very funny guy.
He's a meathead from Long Island.
The best kind.
Yeah. So I want to see how he does at 2:30 a.m. So it's a busy weekend for the UFC once again. 2 events. Check them out. Fight Pass, the first one, second one on Fox Sports 1. We're off next weekend because of the busy UFC 175, etc., going on in the Las Vegas area, and of course, World Series of Fighting happening as well. So we'll be back with you in 2 weeks. But as always, we want to hear from you in the comment section below, so let us know what you thought about anything we said on this particular episode. For Luke, Jeff, Eric, I'm Ariel. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you next time.